Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. We've got a big night tonight with the debut of our latest All in America series coming up shortly. But we begin tonight in Iraq, where Secretary of State John Kerry landed in Baghdad today as the militant Sunni group ISIS seized further territory over the weekend. ISIS has, by numerous accounts, taken multiple additional towns in Iraq, including 3 border crossings, one with neighboring Jordan, and 2 key border crossings with Syria, further consolidating a corridor stretching from Syria through northwest Iraq that effectively dissolves the border between those 2 countries. In the Kurdish town of Jalula, meanwhile, a BBC reporter, Paul Wood, captures the chaos as Kurdish forces are temporarily surrounded by ISIS fighters.
Down here. Okay. We are surrounded in Jalula and cut off. We are with half a dozen men who are trapped with ISIS on 3 sides. You need to find the most senior commander you can find and get them to get the troops. Can you hear me?
In that firefight, ISIS was ultimately pushed back, but it seems increasingly to be the exception. And as Iraq continues to teeter on the edge of breaking apart entirely, Secretary Kerry in Baghdad today attempted to facilitate a political solution, one that can de-escalate the growing sectarian tensions and divisions.
It is essential that Iraq's leaders form a genuinely inclusive government as rapidly as possible within their own constitutional framework. But clearly, if there is evidence that requires some kind of action prior to that process being completed, the president maintains the prerogative of making that decision.
Shia militias in non-ISIS-dominated parts of the country in the south and around Baghdad are arming themselves, preparing to defend the city of Baghdad. And all of this comes just days before a July 1st deadline for those in power in Iraq to form a new unity government. Here at home, a new poll found that 75% of Americans say the Iraq war was not worth the cost. Joining me now, Marie Harf. She's deputy spokesperson for the State Department. So what is the objective of Secretary Kerry today? What would classify this as a successful trip?
Well, thanks for having me tonight, Chris. Secretary Kerry is on the ground today talking to Prime Minister Maliki, to a host of Iraqi leaders about the next steps forward here, about how important it is for them to step up, to seize this moment, and to give their country a better future. We know that they need a new government, one that governs much more inclusively than they've been governing in the past.
Let me ask you this, though. It seems to me you're trying to thread a needle here, or the Secretary is, which is to say, at one level, you don't want the new government to look like essentially a puppet of the U.S. At the same time, you have the Secretary flying in saying we need a new government, flying out with a new government. How can people think that this is actually organically created?
Well, we're not telling the Iraqis what kind of government they should have, and we're not telling them who should be in it. What we're saying is that you need to come together very quickly, time is of the essence, and you need to form an inclusive government. But what that looks like is really up to them in the process that starts, as the Secretary said today, on July 1st. But nothing we do can fix Iraq's problems for it. The Iraqis have to do that themselves.
What leverage does the U.S. have, the Secretary have, the White House have, over Nouri al-Maliki and the current Iraqi government? I mean, form a new government or else what?
Well, they have to form a new government. By law, they had an election, and that process is playing out. But I think what you've seen the president and the secretary say is we are going to stand by Iraq, and we're going to increase our assistance to Iraq. We're going to give them more intelligence, more surveillance, more munitions, 300 military advisors, special forces guys who know how to fight ISIL. But as we do so, their leaders need to step up. We have been crystal clear about that, whether it's Prime Minister Maliki or anyone else, and that our assistance is going to be conditioned on them stepping up.
The 300 military advisors the U.S. has announced it's sending to Iraq, there has been a little bit of contradictory reports, or at least ambiguous ones, about the degree to which they have legal immunity. Of course, legal immunity for American troops in Iraq was the sticking point over which negotiations with the Maliki government fell apart as regarded a residual force. Do those 300 military advisors have legal immunity?
Well, as we said today, we exchanged diplomatic notes with the Iraqi government, and they have given us all the assurances we need that our 300 troops will have all the protections they need. It's a very different force than we were talking about in 2011, so it's not exactly the same situation as we were talking about then, but we would not send our troops into Iraq without the necessary protections. We've been given those by the Iraqi government, who, in this case, as you know, has invited us in, unlike where we were in 2011.
There are some reports indicating that much of the funding for ISIS, or ISIL as it's sometimes referred to, is coming from Saudi Arabia. Not necessarily the royal family, but a lot of money flowing from Saudi Arabia to the insurgents in Syria, to Sunni fighters, to extremists there. Has Secretary Kerry communicated with the Saudi government, who are our supposed allies, about concerns about the money that's flowing from the kingdom to these conflict zones?
Well, we've certainly talked to all of our partners about the concern that folks are funding ISIL. I think it's important to remember that most of ISIL's funding comes from criminal activity, like we've seen recently in terms of the banks in Mosul that they were able to get money from. And if we're concerned about private citizens in anywhere around the region supplying ISIL, we have raised that as well. But no indications that these governments are supporting ISIL. We know this is a threat to the entire region. Folks around the region, Saudi Arabia and others, are concerned about ISIL and are certainly working with us against this common threat.
Given that it was just about a year ago when we seemed on the door of some kind of airstrikes or military escalation in Syria, does the Secretary view the non-military resolution of that through the chemical weapons deal as a policy success in his record as he surveys the region right now?
Well, Chris, all you have to do is look at the fact that today the final 8% of chemical weapons were taken out of Syria, and they will now be destroyed, including on a U.S. ship. So if we look at the fact that the Syrian regime can no longer use their declared chemical weapons against their own people, I think most people would agree that's a good thing. Clearly, there's more work to do, but those chemical weapons, again, the last of which left Syria today, can no longer be used to threaten the people of Syria, which I think has been a good thing.
Marie Harf, Deputy Spokesperson for the State Department. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.